Hello and welcome to my first tier list on my channel. There are currently 96 doctrines in the game, and while eventually I do want to do a comprehensive tier list for all of the doctrines that are in Age of Wonders Planetfall, I also want to explain why I placed each doctrine in each of the tiers and to get my audience thoughts and feedbacks on my initial placement of the doctrines before publishing my comprehensive one. So we'll do one for each of the races that are in the game, and then we may try and do one for all of the secret techs, because there's only 4 doctrines associated with each secret tech, and at that point I think we will be ready to put together a big comprehensive one. If you disagree about the placement of any of my doctrines in the tier list, then please let me know in the comments below, or likewise, if you agree with the placement of my doctrines, then I would also find it helpful to hear those thoughts. I want to make sure that the final product is as useful as possible for as many people, and I only have so many hours to dedicate to playing around with all the different strategies. For example, I haven't played around with covert operations very much, so in this video I will be relying on the forums a little bit for the information that I use to place them. Now, you may be asking yourself, why put all the doctrines in a tier list at all? Well, I have seen a lot of tier lists in a couple places recently, and I personally find them very useful for understanding and breaking down very complicated topics. For example, I saw a really good video by this creator called Stefan Anon on YouTube, who covered the civics in Stellaris. At the beginning, you got to choose 2 civics at the beginning, and then you can't change them very easily. So it's a pretty important decision, and you have a lot of options in front of you. Like with civics in Stellaris, some doctrines in Planetfall just are better than others, and you only get 7 doctrine slots in Planetfall, so the ones that you do pick are going to be things that you want to try and use for either the rest of the game or for a long time, just so you get what you put into it. You get you make more out of that decision than the initial investment. Let's see. Yeah, that honestly is one of the most important decisions that you have to make in a game of Planetfall, the doctrines that you choose. So yeah, this should be pretty helpful for new players, or at least this putting together a couple tier lists should be helpful for them. Well, I could just simply list off which doctrines I like in order of usefulness, like 1 through 96. I do think grouping them based on their general usefulness is incredibly useful for new players. Not only that, but once we get new doctrines with the future expansion, it will place the number ranking for any doctrines that are worse than the new ones, so that won't be as helpful as just a nice visual where they're grouped together based on their general usefulness. Now, at the top we have S tier, which is my favorite. They're basically always good, and you should take them, in my opinion, whenever you get the chance to. A is really good, may have something about it that makes it not quite as good as S tier, or if you synergize enough, maybe some of the things in A tier can be considered S tier, but by itself it's not quite as competitive as S tier. B is still good, but not quite as amazing as A. A is kind of like getting an A on a test, and S is kind of like if you get 100% or more on a test, and B is like getting a B. C is kind of like, it's not great. It's acceptable in certain situations. If you have certain strategies that you're playing towards, taking something in C is okay, but I don't know. I generally wouldn't use anything I placed in C. D is pretty much always not worth the investment. Anything I put in D is pretty bad. But there are a couple things that if you do invest in them, they become quite nice. They actually skip over the C tier and become B tier. And I have decided that in the comprehensive one, we're going to sort the doctrines by their usefulness left to right. So it's kind of like having a list of 1 through 96, and you know exactly how I feel about each doctrine in regards to another one. For example, this tier list has 2 doctrines in the D tier. I want to just scroll down. We got, yeah, One Way Trust and Cloak and Dagger. I had to check their names really quickly. I think I got, yeah, we got One Way Trust on the left, and that's because I like it slightly more than Cloak and Dagger. Now, is there more that we wanted to go over? Yes, we wanted to talk about the legend. Before we move on, we have to talk about the legend, which I have off on the right. We have accessibility, which signifies how early a doctrine can be unlocked through research. The ones that have the 1 in the top left, it signifies that you can get that really early on. You can get that as in the first grouping of research, and the ones that have 3 are in the third grouping of research. It's tier 3 research. Don't let that confuse you. I have tiers with letters, and then there's tiers with numbers for research. And the ones that have bigger numbers, like the one with the 9, there's 2 with 9 next to it in the top left. They are things that you can't unlock until later in the game. They're very inaccessible. They're things that are going to take a while to get to, and then once you get there, you're going to have to put a lot of energy into actually enacting them. Sometimes they're good, sometimes they're worth it, sometimes not. I do have 2 more things in my legend we should go over. If things have that little arrow with a circle around it, that means that if you invest enough in a certain strategy, that doctrine becomes better. So it basically goes from like a C tier to a B tier, or a B tier to an A tier, or if it's in an S tier, it kind of like takes it off of the chart. It's just all around amazing. If you have the option to go for that synergy, you should. It's gonna help you win the game. And then the last thing we have to go over before we actually talk about the doctrines themselves is that last icon, the 2 swords. Some of the doctrines are better against certain opponents. I think there's an Amazon one which gives you a damage bonus against machines, and I'm pretty sure there's a Promethean one which gives you a damage bonus against Amazons. And yeah, I've just signified that those doctrines are really good if you're facing off against certain opponents. Maybe there's an NPC faction you're at war with that will give you an extra damage bonus too. Plus 10% is a pretty significant boost. Plus 20% is amazing. Headphones are trying to turn off here. But yeah, basically those doctrines are completely useless. Probably D tier if you're not fighting against certain specific opponents. You can consider it kind of like a downgrade. That's why I put it on the bottom part of the icons for the doctrines on my tier list. It is almost a downgrade if you're not fighting against the red opponents, but if you are, it's almost like an upgrade. It almost takes it up to the next tier. Okay, now we are ready to jump into each of these individual doctrines. Let's start up at the top with Noble Diplomats. Noble Diplomats is highly accessible. That's what the one in the top left means. You'll be able to get it pretty early on in the game if you research your doctrines immediately. And I would recommend you do that because that benefit that you get there is very, very powerful. Getting a little bit of extra influence and a little bit of energy per faction that you are friendly with is beneficial. Of course, that won't give you anything if you haven't met any NPC factions, so maybe don't go for this immediately. Maybe go for something that will make combat a little bit easier, and then you can do some quests for some factions to take them up to the peace level. But yeah, as soon as you have them past the starting relationship level, once you're getting a little bit of influence from it, you you will want this doctrine because it doubles that influence gain. The first tier of positive diplomacy with the NPC faction gives you +1 influence. The second tier gives you +2, and the third one gives you +3. So instead of getting +1, you'll get +2 influence if you have this doctrine enacted. And instead of getting 2 for the second relationship level, you'll get +4 and a little bit of extra energy on top of that. It's not just the influence. You get +4 influence at the second level, plus 30 energy per turn. That's massive. And at the third level, you get 6 influence instead of just 3 influence, and you're going to get 45 energy per turn. And if you're playing on a larger map, you can use this with all 3 NPC factions to just get an insane amount of influence, allowing you to buy units off of them very quickly, you know, feeding into that synergy. And that's part of why we have that icon there in the top right that says if you invest in this strategy enough, it becomes a lot better. I know that some people like to play the Syndicate a bit evil, but I think this adds a nice option to them, giving them the ability to play nice if they want to. Yeah, I think that's everything I wanted to say on this one. Let's move on to the next one, which is Indentured Servitude. Indentured Servitude is still very, very nice. It's not quite as good as the S tier, obviously, that's why it's not in there, but getting a lot of extra production is really, really important at all stages of the game. If you're early on, you may be building some buildings in your cities or trying to build units. Plus 40% means it will almost take you half as long to build whatever you're trying to build. But it will cost you a little bit of happiness. So not so great in the early game, but this is an inaccessible tech. It's a tier 9 tech, which means you can't get it unless you invest a lot into researching doctrines. And considering that, it's not really worth it. I mean, you can go for it, but honestly, I think investing heavily in this strategy will be to your detriment if you get to a point in the game where you can research this easily. If you have enough research and then you want to use that to build lots of units in the late game, that could be a great way to make your forces just a little bit quicker and a little bit stronger than the enemies. But yeah, I don't know. You have to have pretty sizable colonies to make that useful. Let's move on to the next one. There really wasn't a lot to say on it. It's nice, it's cool to have, but if your colonies are small, it doesn't really pay off for that production bonus, because let's see, a worker can make 5 happiness at the base level, so it can be upgraded to be like 7. Basically, this is between 1 and 2 workers, and that means 1 or 2 workers could be making you 5 or 10 production. So if you get more out of plus 40% than 10, then yeah, that seems like a gain. So as long as you're getting more than 20 production and they start off with 60 production, that sounds like a good trade. So even on the smaller ones, not a terrible trade. Having negative happiness could lead to some issues on the smaller colonies, but being able to build things quicker should allow you to build the happiness buildings. So yeah, ultimately not that terrible. I think we're ready to move on to Indentured Contracts, which is another one that's quite nice, but you do have to invest a lot in Indentured Contracts for it to be as good as some of the other doctrines, because by itself it doesn't really give you a lot of advantage on the battlefield, but by making it cheaper to make indentured units, to use indentured units, you're going to be able to get more on the field and just be a little bit more threatening, to have more presence in general. Maybe not just in the battlefield, but you can discourage people from moving forward by just having more units. I mean, this isn't just good for Syndicate units. You can indenture any of your conquered people, and all indentured units who became so during their mods have their upkeep actually reduced by 50%. It's a little bit more than people who are just your normal old indentured. And while it is cool to like just play Syndicate with their normal indentured, I think you get a little bit more out of just taking all the other races and their strategies that are associated with it and throwing it into your army. I think the Overseer is really cool with them because it can give like double attacks to melee units. So you can, like, I don't know, jetpack some Kirko in, get 3 attacks, then have Overseer give them another set of attacks. Really, really nice. But only really if you invest enough into it, and that means having a lot of indentured units. So yeah, it almost was an A tier, but not quite. I kept it in this one. It makes more sense, I think, when you compare it to all the other doctrines that I have already organized into the different tier lists. But we'll see. We'll see how you feel about it after you've seen all the other ones. Now we're ready to talk about our next doctrine, which is Deep Infiltration. Infiltration, sorry. Funny way of saying it, right? This is the first one that actually has the swords on it because you get a little bit of extra damage against people that you have infiltrated, which is something that you do have to invest in using covert ops. So it's quite different from all the other doctrines that I marked with the swords because most of them were good against a certain type of unit, and that meant if you saw that unit, awesome. If you didn't see that unit, not so great. If you're fighting a player that you haven't infiltrated, this isn't so great, but then you can all of a sudden just infiltrate them and you get that bonus damage against their units. I like using the bonus damage against mobs. I think it really helps you clear out locations and landmarks a little bit quicker. So in a lot of ways, I think this is worse than the other ones, and it is a tier 9 tech, so it's really late game. You won't be able to implement this until you get pretty far down the line. And again, you probably don't want to enact it until you've researched all of your covert operations. So the fact that it's inaccessible isn't that negative. Yeah, I could see this being kind of useful in maybe a multiplayer game where you're not necessarily telling people that you're going to come after them. You infiltrate a player, and then all of a sudden you swoop in and you just rush them because, you know, that extra 20% damage will allow your tier 1 units to be far more competitive with their higher tier units, and yeah, your higher tier units will just wipe out theirs really, really quickly. But honestly, I haven't used it in a game. I never use covert ops, so that might be part of why I put it so far down on my tier list, why it's only in C. Now, I think we're ready to talk about D, which when I was talking about earlier, I think I said something wrong about One-Way Trust and Cloak and Dagger. I believe I said that One-Way Trust had a synergy icon next to it and Cloak and Dagger didn't. That's backwards. Cloak and Dagger has the synergy icon. It gets better if you invest a lot in covert operations, whereas One-Way Trust, it's okay. It's not really okay. It's not really worth spending the points on because getting a little bit of extra defense is kind of nice if you're playing against some really high level AI that has rushed the covert operations. But to be honest, that's not that bad, not that hard to deal with. If you're facing off against the AI, they're probably not going to level their heroes up very much. So sure, they can steal your energy, but when you actually come into contact with them and fight them, they won't have the armies they need to actually deal with you. And if you're playing against human players, odds are that you won't need too much extra covert op defense unless they're one of those players that loves to be annoying and steal stuff, take dice rolls. But you know, it is a dice roll. You can get nothing out of it, which means not my favorite way to spend resources, especially with how limited you are in Planetfall. So yeah, I really don't like one-way trust. I think it is slightly worse in a lot of ways than Cloak and Dagger, but in other ways it is better because say you're not using covert ops, say you're just getting attacked a bunch, you can implement one-way trust to keep other people from stealing your stuff. They're pretty equal. They're almost tied. I think there's like one doctrine in between the two in the comprehensive tier list that I put together. I'm leaning towards Cloak and Dagger being better right now, but I know when I did my notes earlier, I said, well, one-way trust might be better in more situations, so I guess maybe I'll put that one first. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the subject, to be honest. Alright, so I was just reviewing the video and my notes, and I noticed that I didn't talk about Cloak and Dagger too much, and there was one aspect in here which I think ultimately led to me ranking it lower than one-way trust, and that's because making the covert operations a little bit cheaper really only saves you a little bit of influence when you're trying to steal energy, and a lot of people don't typically take their covert operations up to the research level because it takes research to then steal research off of other people, so it's not really the best use of your resources. There's better ways to spend your time and your resources like influence and energy. So yeah, basically it can save you a little tiny bit of influence, but ultimately not that much. If you're trying to get influence, it's better to go for things like noble diplomats. But I could see some people having a lot of success with this in a multiplayer setting. If you just want to be a bit of a troll, I think it could be good in that situation. So in that situation, it has lots of synergy. That's it. That's all of the doctrines and all of the notes I had on them. I'm really interested to hear what people are thinking about my placement of these 5 doctrines. Wait, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 doctrines. We got a lot more to go, and yeah, I'm not sure if we're gonna change anything else about this, about the formatting. I was hoping for a shorter video. It looks like this is going to be longer than 20 minutes. Hopefully next week is a little bit shorter. I don't think I'll have nearly as much to say. If you enjoyed this, don't forget to leave a like, to subscribe, to share with a friend. I think sharing is one of the best things you can do for a channel, and when I started asking people to do that, my analytics got a lot better. When I started posting them to things like Discord and Twitter, once again it got even better. So yeah, hope to see you around. Have a good one.